Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every week on all aspects of the past. Today on History Calling we're looking at a bizarre royal execution, that of George Duke of Clarence in the Tower of London in 1478. George was the younger sibling of the king, and the story of how Edward IV killed his brother has made George's one of the most famous royal deaths in English history. Stay tuned to hear about the strange way in which Clarence supposedly met his end, whether or not the stories about his horrible cause of death are true, the role his sister-in-law, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, may have played in his death, and whether he was killed in an attempt to prevent prophecy about the royal succession coming true. Just to let you know before we dive in that next week's video, which is Christmas themed, will be going live a couple of days early on Wednesday at 8 PM UK time. This is because I prefer not to post on Christmas Eve, which is falling on a Friday this year. I'm sure a lot of you are too busy on that day to watch YouTube, and as you may or may not know, I like to babysit my videos for the first couple of hours that they're up and answer the early comments, but I expect to be busy that evening too, so I just decided it was easier to alter my schedule. To make sure you don't forget about this change or miss any of my other uploads, please remember to subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on, and if you enjoy my content, give this video a like and share it with your friends. You can follow me on Instagram too, where my username is historycalling, and there's a link for that in the description box below. George Plantagenet was born here in Dublin Castle on the 21st of October 1449 during his father's term as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. By the by, I know that this image dates to over 130 years later, but it's the oldest depiction I'm aware of the castle. His parents were Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, and he had an older brother named Edward and a younger one named Richard. You probably know them better as Edward IV and Richard III. Together, these boys were known as the Three Sons of York, and they would play major roles in the conflict now known as the Wars of the Roses. It's not my intention to get sucked into giving a history here of these long and complicated wars, but a brief summary of the Yorks' involvement up to 1478 will help you to understand how George ended up dead at the behest of his brother at the age of just 28. The boys' father died, along with their 17-year-old brother Edmund, at the Battle of Wakefield in December 1460. A little over 2 months later, and still aged only 18, Edward took the throne from Henry VI, who was quickly locked up in the Tower of London, though his wife Margaret of Anjou and their son Edward, Prince of Wales, remained free. The 11-year-old George was created Duke of Clarence, showered with lands and other titles, and was at the time the heir to his childless brother's throne. The two would go on to have a fractious relationship, however. In 1469, against his brother's express commands, George married Isabel Neville, daughter of the Earl of Warwick, a man who was turning from a staunch ally of Edward's into his enemy. Together, these two men became a joint thorn in the king's side, scheming to depose Edward and replace him with George. When this failed, they allied themselves with Queen Margaret and the Prince of Wales, successfully deposed Edward and put Henry VI back on the throne in October 1470. Warwick now married his younger daughter Anne to Prince Edward, and George, not happy with his decrease in status in the new regime, soon switched sides again and went back to his brother in April 1471. Edward retook the throne the same month, and Warwick was killed fighting against him on the 14th of April at the Battle of Barnet. The 17-year-old Prince of Wales died on the 4th of May at the Battle of Tewkesbury, while Henry VI was locked up in the Tower of London again and soon died or was murdered there. But that's a story for another video. Publicly, the York brothers were reconciled, but their relationship continued to deteriorate over the next 7 years, especially as George and Richard engaged in a spat over the Warwick inheritance, as George was married to Isabel Neville, while her sister Anne, the one-time Princess of Wales, married Richard, who was the Duke of Gloucester, in 1472. George's judgment and mental state then took a nosedive after the death of his wife in December 1476, most likely from childbirth complications. He had one of her servants abducted, and in the course of a single day in April 1477 had the woman indicted, convicted and executed for supposedly poisoning Isabel. Clarence was further angered by the fact that Edward had taken Richard's side in the dispute over the Warwick inheritance, and by the king's refusal to allow him to remarry where he chose. Then several of his servants were accused and found guilty of planning the king's death. Though Clarence was not involved, he stupidly had one of the men's scaffold speeches, in which he declared his innocence, read out to the royal council. When Edward found out, this, combined with the judicial murder of Isabel's servant, pushed him over the edge. He had Clarence arrested and thrown in the Tower of London, and the Duke was quickly found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. Some sources, and I'll be discussing these in a moment, said that Edward's wife, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, urged her husband to have the Duke killed, fearing that her own son would never succeed to the throne while George lived. This was because there were questions over the legality of her marriage to Edward, who had possibly married another woman named Eleanor Talbot before wedding Elizabeth. If Elizabeth's children were illegitimate, George was next in line and had already shown himself prepared to depose his family from the throne. There is also a story, likely apocryphal, that Edward and Elizabeth were frightened by a prophecy that Edward would be succeeded by a man whose name started with the letter G. This, of course, could also be read as being his other brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. For more on the fate of Edward and Elizabeth's sons, the so-called princes in the Tower, and the involvement their uncle Gloucester may have had in their mysterious disappearance from the Tower of London in 1483, see my video on their story, which I'll leave linked on screen and in the description box. But now back to George, whose death sentence was carried out within the Tower on the 18th of February 1478. The apparent manner of his death, if the stories are true, is one of the strangest methods of execution ever employed for a royal prisoner. According to numerous sources, the Duke of Clarence was drowned to death in a vat of malmsey wine. How likely is it that this bizarre tale is true, however? To answer that, let's look at what the sources say and how far we can trust them. The earliest account we have of Clarence's cause of death was written about 5.5 years after the event. It was composed by an Italian scholar named Dominic Mancini in late 1483 as part of a report written for the Archbishop of Vienne. Mancini said that the Queen remembered the insults to her family, and that it was said she was not the legitimate wife of the king. Thus she concluded that her offspring by the king would never come to the throne unless the Duke of Clarence was removed, and of this she easily persuaded the king. Accordingly, whether the charge was fabricated or a real plot revealed, the Duke of Clarence was accused of conspiring the king's death by means of spells and magicians. When the charge had been considered before a court, he was condemned and put to death. The mode of execution preferred in this case was that he should die by being plunged into a jar of sweet wine. Mancini had recently been in England. He left in the summer of 1483, and though he didn't speak English, he had good court connections and would have had access to translators whilst there to obtain the latest gossip. It was also in his best interest to provide accurate information to his superior, the bishop, rather than tell tall tales which could quickly be disproved. I therefore see no reason to doubt that he was telling the truth, or at the very least what he believed to be true. Writing in about 1484, we have another account, this time from the French writer Jean de Roy, which says that it was only at the behest of the men's mother, Cecily, Dowager Duchess of York, that Clarence's fate was not much worse. De Roy says that after Edward locked George up, the said King Edward assembled his council, by whose deliberations he, meaning Clarence, was condemned to be led from the said Tower of London, being dragged on his buttocks to the gibbet of the said City of London, and there to be cut open and his entrails thrown into a fire, and then his neck should be cut and his body made into 4 quarters. But afterwards, by the great prayer and request of the mother of the said Edward and Clarence, his sentence was changed and moderated, so that in the month of February of the said year, Clarence, being a prisoner in the Tower of London, was taken and brought out of his said prison, and after he had been confessed, was thrust alive in a cask of malmsey opened at one end, his head downwards, and there he remained until he had given up the ghost, and then he was pulled out and his neck was cut. De Roy concludes by saying correctly that Clarence was taken to be buried with his wife Isabel at Tewkesbury Abbey. Other near-contemporary sources follow broadly the same story. Philippe de Comines, who was originally from Flanders but who worked in the courts of Burgundy and France, wrote in the mid-1490s that King Edward caused his brother, the Duke of Clarence, to be drowned in a pipe of malmsey, charging him with a design of endeavouring to dethrone him. French writer Olivier de la Marche, who died in 1502, claimed that the King of England found a way of having his brother again, which I think means gaining physical custody of him, and had him killed in a bath, as it is said. This differs a little from most other sources, as Clarence is not drowned in wine, but the basic mode of execution remains the same. Other writers were less certain of what had occurred. The Crowland or Croyland Chronicle, which is probably a late 15th century English document masquerading as one which dates back to the 12th century, states only that, in a few days after, the execution, whatever its nature may have been, took place, and would that it had ended these troubles, in the Tower of London, it being the year of our Lord 1478 and the 18th of the reign of King Edward. Most accounts follow the drowning in wine narrative, however. Another French chronicler, Jean Molyneux, who died in 1507, wrote in his book Chroniques 1476 to 1506 that Edward allowed Clarence to choose his own mode of death, quote, and he prayed that he could die in a vat full of malvasia, meaning malmsey, and so it was. Molyneux's work is therefore especially important as it provides an explanation as to where the idea for this strange execution method came from. The English chronicler Robert Fabian, who was writing no later than the early 1510s, and whose book The New Chronicles of England and France was published in 1516, said that this year, that is to mean the 18th day of February, the Duke of Clarence, brother to the king, then being prisoner in the Tower, was secretly put to death and drowned in a barrel of malvasia within the said tower. Italian author Polydore Vergil, who arrived in England in 1502, drafted his book Anglicae Historia in 1512-13, though it wasn't published until 1534. According to him, Edward, quote, suddenly commanded the arrest and execution of his brother, Duke George of Clarence, who was put to death, as they say, in a barrel of Cretan wine, setting the worst example in human memory. When Henry VIII's minister, Thomas More, came to write his history of King Richard III in the 1510s, though it was unpublished until 1557, he claimed that Elizabeth Woodville had been partly to blame for what happened, and said, were he faulty, were he faultless, attainted was he by Parliament and judged to the death, and thereupon hastily drowned in a butt of malmsey. He adds, though, that Edward, despite having ordered his brother's death, regretted it afterwards, and piteously bewailed and sorrowfully repented. Nearly a century after Clarence's demise, English chronicler Ralph or Raphael Holinshed, whose chronicles of England, Scotland and Ireland were published in 1577, wrote that finally the Duke was cast into the Tower, and therewith adjudged for a traitor, and privily drowned in a butt of malmsey, the 11th of March, in the beginning of the 17th year of the King's reign. The date of Clarence's death does not match earlier sources, but once again we see the same strange method of execution. Holinshed also mentions the prophecy of a man with a name starting with G taking the throne, which supposedly alarmed Edward and Elizabeth so much. There is one last tantalizing piece of evidence in the form of this portrait. It is possibly of Clarence's daughter, Margaret, Countess of Salisbury, and is now housed in the National Portrait Gallery in London. At first, all seems normal enough, but look at the sitter's wrist. She is wearing a tiny wine casket on it, which, it has been mooted, was an allusion to the fate of her father. This is assuming the portrait is Margaret, however, which is not certain. So what to make of all these sources? Well, on the downside, none of them date from 1478, the year of Clarence's death, and, with the possible exception of the portrait, none are traceable to a member of the royal family, to a person who claimed to be present at the execution, or to any official governmental record. On the upside, though not quite contemporary accounts of his death, most of the sources I have talked to you about were written within living memory of the events of February 1478, and it is striking how similar they are. Indeed, there is no source which gives any cause of death for George other than drowning, and the vast majority say that it was in wine. For me, this level of uniformity amongst independently written sources is a strong indicator that the broad strokes of the story they are telling are true. Just compare the stories surrounding George's death to the multitude of tales surrounding the supposed murder of his nephews, the princes in the Tower, in the years after their disappearance in 1483. In that case, no date of death could be agreed upon and numerous potential causes of death were put forward. In George's case, all the rumours or stories of what had happened to him are so well aligned with one another, even decades after the fact when there had been plenty of time for conspiracy theories to spring up, that I find them to be compelling. In other words, if I had to put money on it, I would say that George, Duke of Clarence, was indeed drowned in wine in the Tower of London on the 18th of February 1478. I'm interested in what you think, however. Let me know in the comments below if you find the story of George's demise to be believable, and if not, why not? Remember too to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you're interested in this period of history, you might also like my videos on the life of Henry VII or my playlist on the 6 wives of Henry VIII. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.